On a quiet morning at an upscale coffee, Amber, a young black waitress, accidentally overheard two powerful businessmen plotting to betray a billionaire. She knew she wasn't supposed to get involved, but staying silent meant letting the wrong people win. So, Amber decided to warn him. What she didn't know was that this small act would not only save a company, but also completely change the course of her own life. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The morning air carried a gentle chill as sunlight crept across the sleek windows of Belmont Cafe, a quiet haven tucked into the corner of a busy financial district. Inside, the hum of soft jazz blended with the clinking of cutlery and the occasional low murmur of conversation. Everything about the place felt refined. From the polished marble floors to the delicate aroma of ground Ethiopian coffee drifting through the room. The clientele matched the space composed, sharply dressed their lives, carved around balance sheets and power plays. Sitting near the back at a private table, just far enough from the entrance to afford discretion, were two men in tailored suits who belonged exactly where they were. Arnold Lawrence, in his late 52nds, had the kind of calm authority that didn't need announcing. His salt and pepper hair was neatly parted, his tie perfectly centered. There was a softness to his eyes, a steady clarity that often led people to trust him before he even spoke. Across from him sat Vincent Kennedy, a man a few years younger, whose smile flickered more than it stayed, and whose fingers never stopped tapping lightly against the edge of his water glass. Together, they ran one of the most promising infrastructure development firms in the state, and this morning they were about to finalize a deal that could elevate them into a different league entirely. Amber Jenkins moved between tables with the silent grace of someone who had learned to anticipate need before it was voiced. Her uniform was neat, her posture upright, but her eyes stayed low, not out of fear, but caution. She'd been at Belmont for nearly 9 months now, long enough to know who tipped out of kindness and who tipped for power. She also knew when to blend in, when to disappear behind her tray, and let the room forget she was there. She had done that most of her life, especially in rooms like this. Amber was 26, intelligent, observant, and used to being underestimated, but she didn't mind, at least not on most days. As she approached Arnold and Vincent's table, Vincent gestured toward his empty glass without looking at her. "Water," he said flatly, eyes still on his phone. Amber nodded, biting the inside of her cheek, and moved to refill his glass. Arnold, on the other hand, glanced up and offered a brief, polite smile. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes for half a second before turning his attention back to Vincent. That moment of eye contact didn't last long, but it was enough for Amber to note that this man, unlike most who walked through those doors, at least acknowledged her presence. Back at the table, Vincent leaned in slightly. His voice dropped low, casual on the surface, but with a kind of urgency pushing through. "We're ready," he said. "Let's get this done today. No need to drag it out, right?" Arnold nodded, adjusting his cufflinks with a measured motion. "We'll go through the final copy after breakfast. I want to double-check the equity splits before we sign anything." Vincent forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, it's just, we've reviewed this a dozen times already." "I know," Arnold said calmly. "But this is a big step. I want to get it right." Vincent leaned back, laughing lightly, though his foot tapped a little faster beneath the table. "You and your due diligence. Fine. Just don't let it hold us back." Amber returned with the water and placed the glass down gently in front of Vincent. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. Arnold gave a nod of thanks again, and Amber offered the faintest smile in return before walking away. She didn't need much to notice things. Small signs told bigger stories, and Vincent's tension wasn't subtle. Something about the way he was pushing the deal so hard didn't sit right. But Amber wasn't there to judge. She was there to serve coffee, refill glasses, and pretend not to hear things she wasn't supposed to hear. A few minutes passed. Arnold excused himself to use the restroom. Vincent took the opportunity to make a call. He glanced around, but his attention never fell on Amber, who had quietly stepped into the side corridor, hidden partly behind a service wall. Her intention wasn't to spy. She was reaching for a clean napkin tray when she heard Vincent speak. His voice had dropped to a near whisper, but the words still carried in the quiet corner of the cafe. "He has no idea," Vincent said, his tone sharp, his pace quick. "By the time he signs that contract, the control shifts entirely. The holding company's ready. I'll move everything by end of week. He'll be out before he realizes what happened." Amber froze. Her fingers hovered over the tray, unmoving. Her heart picked up pace in her chest. She stayed quiet, breathing shallowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. She waited, listened. Vincent continued, his voice soaked in arrogance. "I've been laying the groundwork for months. Nobody questions me. They all think Arnold's the brain, the face. Let him be. It's almost too easy." The call ended. Vincent adjusted his cufflink, stood, and walked toward the exit to take another call outside. Amber remained behind the wall for a few more seconds, gripping the napkin tray so tightly her knuckles ached. She wasn't supposed to hear that. She didn't want to hear that. But now she had, and the truth echoed in her mind with painful clarity. This wasn't just business betrayal. This was something carefully orchestrated, cold and personal. She stepped back into the kitchen, her expression blank, her movements mechanical. She set the napkin tray down and stared at the tiles on the wall, the hum of the espresso machine in the background barely registering. Her co-workers moved around her, none noticing the storm behind her calm face. She tried to push it aside, tried to tell herself it wasn't her problem, but the words wouldn't leave her. "He has no idea. I'll move everything. It's almost too easy." She wiped her hands on a clean towel and steadied her breath. Her pulse still raced, but something inside her had shifted. She had seen plenty of lies in her life, watched people get hurt because no one warned them, because no one spoke up, because people like her were always expected to stay silent. Arnold returned to the table, unaware of anything unusual. He sat down, took a sip of his coffee, and glanced at the contract folder beside his plate. Vincent re-entered the cafe shortly after, all smiles and charisma, as if the call outside had been about brunch plans, not betrayal. Amber watched from the service window. Her mind was no longer calm. Her hands trembled slightly as she dried a glass. She had no personal stake in this, but she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard. She couldn't unhear what had just happened. And something inside her whispered that this wasn't just about saving a man's business. It was about doing what was right. That thought wouldn't let go. It clung to her like a weight in her chest, even as she tried to focus on the simple rhythm of service. Refill, clear, smile, repeat. But it was no longer a normal morning, not anymore. Something was coming, and now she was part of it. Under the soft glow of the Belmont Cafe's lighting, Amber stood still, her hands carefully wiping the same countertop she had already cleaned twice. Her breath came slower now, more controlled than it had been moments earlier, but the pounding in her chest had not settled. She had not meant to overhear anything, and she certainly hadn't gone looking for trouble. But trouble had found her in the form of Vincent Kennedy's hushed but damning phone call. And now she was carrying a secret that didn't belong to her, a truth that weighed more with each passing second. The thought of doing nothing tugged at her like a rope around the waist. It would be so much easier to stay quiet, to convince herself it wasn't her place. But the image of Arnold sitting there unaware, preparing to sign away everything he had built, was something she couldn't shake. She had seen betrayal before up close and the damage it left behind. She knew what it looked like when no one had the courage to step forward. So this time she would speak. Amber glanced up just in time to see Vincent slip outside his phone, pressed to his ear, his expression smooth as always. She wiped her hands quickly and steadied her breath. There was no plan, no speech prepared, only the sharp, unwavering sense that this was the moment. And if she missed it, she might never forgive herself. She made her way toward table 8 with quiet, deliberate steps, careful not to draw attention from the few remaining patrons. Arnold was still reading eyes, skimming across the contract papers. As she approached, he looked up with polite confusion, not expecting her return. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir," she said, her voice low, just above a whisper, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know this isn't really appropriate, but I heard something just now about the man you're meeting with." Arnold blinked once, his brow furrowing slightly. He leaned back subtly, shifting his posture, signaling both attention and caution. "What did you hear?" he asked, his tone calm, but unmistakably guarded. Amber glanced briefly toward the door, then back to Arnold. She leaned in closer, her voice just a notch above breath. "He said that once you sign this contract, everything becomes his. That he's been planning it, that you won't even see it coming until it's too late." Arnold didn't respond right away. His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened as he searched her face, weighing every word. The silence between them stretched out heavy and still. Amber continued, "I know how this sounds. I know I'm just a waitress, and I know he's probably someone you've known a long time, but I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't sure about what I heard. I don't expect you to trust me. I just couldn't stay silent." Arnold's gaze lingered on her for another moment. He looked at her face, then at her hands, then down at the papers in front of him. His fingers gently tapped the corner of the contract. He took a breath, then spoke carefully. "Vincent and I have been partners for decades. We've been through more than most people could imagine, so you'll understand if I say this is not something I can just take at face value." Amber nodded. She had expected this. "Yes, sir, I do understand. But I figured, if I were in your place, I'd want to know. That's all." Her voice didn't waver, and her eyes didn't flinch. There was no desperation in her tone, no need for him to believe her immediately. Only conviction, only the quiet insistence the truth mattered, even if it came from someone no one expected it from. Arnold leaned back slightly, folding his hands in front of him. There was something in his posture that shifted, just a small release of the shoulders, a subtle signal that while he might not act on this moment now, he wasn't dismissing it either. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amber Jenkins." He nodded slowly. "All right, Amber. Thank you." Amber hesitated, then nodded once and stepped back, retreating toward the kitchen without another word. No one had noticed the exchange. To any other customer in the room, it looked like she was doing her job. To her, it had felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing if there was ground below. Behind her, Arnold sat still. He looked at the contract in front of him, then slowly closed the folder. His mind wasn't on the numbers anymore. It was backpedaling, replaying conversations, interaction, small signs he had brushed off. A memory surfaced of Vincent, insisting he didn't need to reread the clauses. "It's all boilerplate," he had said. "Just formality." But now that confidence took on a different hue, a shade of control, of planning. Amber returned to her station, picking up a tray and reorganizing utensils that didn't need organizing. Her fingers were steady now, but her pulse had not slowed. She had no idea what would happen next, whether Arnold would believe her, whether Vincent would find out, whether she would be out of a job by the end of the week. But she had done it. She had chosen not to stay silent, and that alone steadied her breath. Outside the cafe window, Vincent was still on the phone, pacing slowly with that same measured confidence. Inside, Arnold watched him through the glass, eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet, unsettling curiosity. Something had changed. He didn't know what he believed yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He could no longer look at Vincent the same way. The morning light had shifted. What had begun as a routine breakfast between old friends had taken on a different weight. No voices were raised. No confrontations had happened, but beneath the surface, fault lines had begun to form, and if Amber was right, they would only get wider. Arnold folded his hands again and remained still, a man with too many thoughts and not enough proof. But he would find out carefully, quietly. just as the warning had come to him. In a whisper, Arnold didn't say anything to Vincent that afternoon. He went through the motions of their routine, like nothing had changed, reviewing the contract, making notes, engaging in casual banter. But something had changed. Amber's warning echoed in the back of his mind with every glance at Vincent's face, every confident gesture, every word that now carried a trace of something else. Before that morning, he would have brushed off any suggestion that Vincent could betray him. Now he found himself watching more closely, noticing things that hadn't stood out before. The way Vincent deflected when asked about specific terms, the subtle shift in tone whenever control of the company came up. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to put Arnold on edge. That evening, long after most of the office lights had gone dark and the cleaning crew had made their rounds, Arnold sat alone in his corner office. The city lights cast a soft blue hue across the glass conference table. The contract folder sat untouched beside his laptop. Instead of reviewing it again, he found himself typing something entirely different. Amber Jenkins. The employee records offered only basic information. Belmont Cafe staff hired 9 months ago. No prior disciplinary notes. There was nothing in the internal system beyond what anyone on payroll would have. But something told him there was more to her than a name on a schedule and a polite smile, so he searched further. What he found wasn't scandalous, wasn't shocking, but it was revealing. Amber had been a student at Franklin South Community College studying economics. Full academic scholarship, Dean's List. Her first 2 years. A short opinion article she wrote, titled Transparency and Trust in Corporate Governance, had been featured in the school's quarterly business journal. The writing was thoughtful, balanced, more insightful than he would have expected from someone that age. But what stood out most was the sudden end to her academic trail. She had dropped out during her 3rd year. No scandal, no expulsion, just a withdrawal. A note buried in a financial aid report confirmed the recent family medical emergency. Her mother had suffered a stroke. Arnold sat back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. It all made sense now why someone with that kind of academic record and interest in finance was working as a waitress. Not because she lacked ambition, but because life had intervened and she hadn't complained. She hadn't mentioned her education when she warned him. She hadn't used it to gain credibility. She had simply stated what she heard and let him decide what to do with it. That quiet dignity struck Arnold harder than he expected. In a world where so many people thought to be heard, Amber had chosen silence until it mattered most. The next morning, Arnold arrived at Bellman earlier than usual. He didn't have a meeting scheduled, and Vincent wasn't expecting him. He came alone, sat near the window and ordered black coffee. From his seat, he could see Amber working. She moved through the space with calm efficiency, prepping tables, aligning silverware, checking water glasses without being told. There was no fanfare to her movement, no performance, just quiet care in everything she did. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally looked up, their eyes met briefly. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But there was a silent acknowledgement between them, a shared awareness of what had passed between them the day before. As she returned to her duties, Arnold's attention drifted to the others in the cafe. 2 employees were chatting near the barista counter, not loud, but not particularly discreet either. One of them, a younger man with a tight haircut and an apron slung loose around his waist, nodded toward Amber. "She always acts like she runs this place," he muttered. "Thinks she's gunning for management." His co-worker smirked. "Or maybe she's hoping the old guy gives her a reason to quit." They both chuckled and then went back to restocking cups. Arnold didn't react. He didn't turn his head or scold them, but a cold weight settled in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd heard remarks like that, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. It wasn't overt hatred. It wasn't blatant, but it was there, dripping in assumptions, in condescension, in the comfort people felt mocking someone who didn't have the power to speak back. He didn't know whether Amber had heard it. She gave no sign if she had. Her hands kept moving. Her eyes stayed focused, But it made Arnold think even more carefully about what she had done. She had stepped into something she could have walked away from. She had done it quietly without asking for protection or credit. And now she was enduring judgment for a conversation no one even knew she had. He finished his coffee and left without saying a word. But as he sat in his car in the parking lot, watching the people pass by on the sidewalk, his mind was already moving forward. There was too much at stake to rely on intuition alone. He needed facts. He needed confirmation. If Vincent was planning something, Arnold would find it. And he would do it the same way Amber had approached him, with discretion, with clarity, and without drama. That afternoon, Arnold made a private call to someone he trusted, a financial investigator he had used in past due diligence reviews. His name was Julian Park. Sharp-minded, methodical, discreet. Arnold didn't offer every detail. Not yet. He simply asked Julian to look into Vincent's personal and company-related financial activity over the past year. Transfers, new accounts, anything unusual. I don't want this getting flagged as internal. Arnold said, I'm just trying to be thorough. Julian, used to working in grey areas, didn't ask unnecessary questions. Understood. I'll get back to you in a few days. As the day wound down, Arnold returned to his desk, but not to the contract. He opened Amber's article again. He read it slowly, this time line by line. The point she made about accountability, about the way companies lose their moral compass when leadership stops listening to uncomfortable truths, those lines hit harder. Now, he didn't know where this situation was going yet, but he knew the old rules no longer applied, and maybe the people he had dismissed, even unconsciously, were the ones who saw the truth more clearly than anyone else. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Arnold wasn't just suspicious. He was focused. The storm that had started with a whisper had found a listener, and now, quietly, methodically, he would follow it wherever it led. Julian called on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The sky outside Arnold's office was a dull grey, stray, with water running down the windows like veins. Arnold had been reviewing budget projections when his private line rang. Seeing Julian's name, he muted his computer screen and answered immediately, his tone quiet but alert. Julian began getting straight to the point. I don't have the full picture yet, but we're starting to see patterns. Something is definitely off with Vincent's financial activity. Arnold leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, though no one could see him. What kind of patterns? He's been moving money into an offshore account over the past 9 months. Small amounts spaced out, always just under the reporting threshold. It's enough to raise a red flag. Not enough yet to prove criminal intent, but it's deliberate, structured, hidden. Arnold said nothing for a few seconds, letting the information settle in his mind. The pieces were beginning to align. Amber's warning, Vincent's increasing push to finalize the contract, the defensive posture during their last meeting. Now, this money disappearing quietly behind the scenes. He rubbed his thumb against his temple and exhaled slowly. Keep going, he said finally. Dig deeper. Vendor payments, new corporate accounts, shell companies. I want to know if this is just preparation, or if he's already started taking things out from under me. Julian's voice didn't change. Understood. I'll expand the scope discreetly. When the call ended, Arnold didn't return to his budget spreadsheets. Instead, he stood and walked to the wide office window, watching the rain fall over the city below. The glass felt cold under his fingertips. He had built Lawrence Kennedy with his own hands, starting from nothing with Vincent. And now, if this was true, if what he suspected was happening right under his nose, then it wasn't just money or reputation at risk. It was the betrayal of something deeper, trust, legacy, a lifetime. Back at Belmont the next morning, everything appeared normal. Amber moved through the floor with the same quiet efficiency, the same deliberate attention to detail. She hadn't spoken to Arnold since that brief exchange, and she didn't try to. She had no idea what he had done with the information she gave him. No clue if he believed her or dismissed it. But the look in his eyes that day, that brief flicker of tension of weight, told her he hadn't forgotten. Arnold arrived later than usual and sat alone again, further from the main windows this time. He watched Vincent walk in 10 minutes later, as confident as ever, tossing his jacket over a chair and ordering his usual with a wave. The man was smiling, relaxed, making small talk with a young associate who had joined them for breakfast. If Vincent had any sense that the ground beneath him was shifting, he didn't show it. That, Arnold thought, was what made it more dangerous. Vincent believed he was untouchable. They met at the office later that afternoon for a scheduled strategy session. Vincent was already in the conference room, whiteboard filled with notes, charts displayed on the wall screen. He spoke quickly, pitching an international expansion plan, complete with projected ROI and partnership leads in 3 countries. "It's all lined up," Vincent said, gesturing at the board. "We lock in the capital this quarter, push the contract through, and by spring we're already ahead of forecast." Arnold nodded slowly, arms crossed. "Sounds solid. Who's managing the vendor relationships on this?" Vincent paused. Just a fraction of a second, but Arnold saw it. "Same group as last time," Vincent replied smoothly. "I've got eyes on all of it. I'd like to take a look at those vendor lists myself," Arnold said, keeping his tone even. "Just want to make sure we're not missing anything." "Sure," Vincent said, still smiling, but the corners of his mouth didn't lift quite as high. "I'll have them sent over." Arnold gave a small nod and said nothing more. He didn't need to push harder yet. He was watching. Every word, every pause, every deflection. That night, Julian sent over preliminary documents. The offshore account had a name attached to it, one of Vincent's old college contacts, who now ran a consultancy firm overseas. Transfers had started just as Arnold and Vincent began discussing the new contract terms. Julian had also found vendor payments routed through secondary shell companies, all recently formed, all connected by indirect ownership to a holding structure that led back to Vincent's legal trust. It was enough, not for court, not for scandal, but enough for Arnold to know with absolute certainty that what Amber had said was true, that what he had feared was no longer just fear. It was fact. He sat at his desk for a long time. The documents spread out before him. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights blinked through the glass like silent witnesses. He thought of Vincent's laugh, the way he had toasted to their success last quarter, the way he'd always called Arnold brother when things went well. He thought of how easily that trust had been turned into a weapon. And then he thought of Amber, how she had said nothing until it mattered, how she had asked for nothing in return, how she had warned him with no promise of being believed. That kind of integrity deserved something better than silence. He picked up his phone and texted Julian. "Keep the investigation going quietly. I need a full picture. Every piece. I'll let you know when it's time." Arnold set the phone down, then reached for the contract Vincent had drafted. He opened it to the final page and read the signature line where his name was typed, "Waiting. Not today. Tomorrow." Maybe he would begin setting the trap, but tonight he would sit with the weight of the truth and the responsibility that came with it. Vincent arrived at the office that Monday morning with the confidence of a man who believed he was winning. His blazer was perfectly pressed, his shoes shined, and his smile just wide enough to seem effortless. He greeted everyone he passed with a casual wave, made a joke with the receptionist, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee from the executive lounge like it was just another day. For him, it was. But for Arnold, the air in the office had grown heavier. There was no panic, no outburst, just the quiet tightening of routines, the way a seasoned chess player studies the board before making the move that forces a check. Arnold had scheduled a strategy session with Vincent for later that morning. He had framed it as a final review before moving forward with the expansion deal. Vincent didn't question it. If anything, he seemed energized by the meeting, talking to a junior executive just outside the conference room about potential European vendors. Arnold watched through the glass wall, noting how comfortably Vincent sold himself as a man in control. That confidence was no longer impressive. Now it was dangerous. Once inside the room, Vincent jumped right in. The screen displayed updated charts, performance forecasts, and partnership timelines. His voice was steady, persuasive, and filled with practiced optimism. He pointed to a new supply chain route and explained how it would cut margins by 12% over the next fiscal year. He highlighted legal structures overseas and the efficiency they would provide. Everything on the surface sounded flawless. Arnold listened without interruption. He nodded at the right moments, asked a few clarifying questions, and even offered small acknowledgements of Vincent's foresight. But inside, he wasn't listening to the pitch. He was listening to the man, watching his body language, measuring how quickly he answered when asked about timelines, noting how his voice tightened just slightly when asked about vendor transparency, about these legal entities in Denmark. Arnold said calmly as he tapped his pen against the table. I want to understand the full structure. Who's the primary signatory on the holding? Vincent hesitated, then smiled as if brushing off the weight of the question. Standard setup. The firm managing it handles signatures. We've used them before. No surprises. Arnold nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. I'd still like to see that documentation just to keep our legal team looped in. Of course, Vincent replied smoothly, but this time Arnold caught the faintest flicker of tension in his jaw. After the meeting ended, Vincent lingered at the door. Everything okay with you lately? He asked, keeping his tone casual, but clearly testing the waters. You've been a little more methodical than usual. Arnold offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, thinking more clearly these days. You know how it is. Big decisions deserve a second look. Vincent gave a short laugh, patted the doorframe, and left without further comment. But Arnold could feel the shift. Vincent had noticed the change, even if he didn't understand the reason yet. That evening, Julian sent over another document batch. Buried among financial transfers and vendor names was a discovery that turned Arnold's stomach. One of the companies connected to Vincent's offshore dealings had been in discreet talks with a firm that had previously attempted to acquire Lawrence Kennedy. The acquisition had failed years earlier, but now those same people were back in the conversation, and Vincent was the bridge. Julian included a note with the report. This is more than just financial gain. He's positioning himself for takeover. Arnold didn't respond right away. He read the documents again, slower. This time, absorbing every link, every timestamp, every redirection Vincent had used to keep things hidden. It wasn't just betrayal. It was orchestration, planned, layered, and dangerously close to being completed. The next morning, Arnold met with his internal counsel. No accusations were made, no names spoken aloud, but he began preparing contingency plans, asset freezes, legal lockdowns, transfer protocol delays, all cloaked as standard risk reviews. He wanted everything in place before the confrontation. No room for missteps, no panic. Meanwhile, Vincent carried on as usual, joking in the break room, sending out partnership emails, attending investor calls with polished assurance. But every move he made now passed through Arnold's lens of suspicion, and every smile Vincent gave felt like a crack forming wider. That week, Arnold invited Vincent to dinner at their usual steakhouse, the one where they had celebrated closing their first $1 million contract years ago. Vincent accepted without hesitation. Over drinks, they shared old stories, the kind that made strangers think they were lifelong brothers. But as the main course arrived, Arnold leaned back, swirling his glass slowly. You ever think about how fast things change? He asked, voice even. Vincent looked up amused, like, what markets people? Arnold tilted his head both. 1 minute you trust someone completely. The next, you're double-checking their math. Vincent smirked. Are we still talking about markets? Arnold met his gaze. Just an observation. They didn't speak for a few seconds. The tension wasn't loud, but it was present, resting between them, like something invisible and sharp. Vincent eventually chuckled and raised his glass again. Arnold didn't toast back. He took a sip, then changed the subject, but the silence had done its work. Vincent now understood something had shifted. Later that night, as Arnold drove home, he replayed the conversation. Vincent had dodged just as expected, but he had also shown something new. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell Arnold that the trap was almost ready, that the man who thought he was winning had no idea the game had already turned. And in the back of Arnold's mind, the memory of Amber's voice returned as steady as it had been that morning in the cafe. "I don't expect you to trust me. I just couldn't walk away now." Neither could he. Arnold sat at the head of the long oak conference table, his hands folded calmly in front of him, the morning sun casting sharp, symmetrical shadows across the sleek glass panels behind him. Vincent arrived exactly on time, walking in with the ease of someone who believed he still held the room. He carried a thick black binder under one arm and offered a casual grin as he stepped into the office. "You wanted to go over final revisions?" he asked, setting the binder on the table without waiting for a response. Arnold nodded once without smiling. "Yes, I think it's time we cleared the air." Vincent raised an eyebrow, then took a seat across from Arnold. He leaned back comfortably, his hands resting on the arms of the leather chair, exuding control. Arnold took his time. He opened a separate file from his side of the table, not the contract, but a stack of printed documents bound with a red clip. He slid it across to Vincent slowly, deliberately. "These just came in this morning. Take a look." Vincent glanced down, then picked up the top page. His eyes scanned the first few lines. For a brief moment, the faintest twitch crossed his jaw. He quickly flipped to the next sheet and the next. His fingers moved faster now, his casual posture tightening. The binder he had brought sat untouched. Arnold said nothing, letting the silence fill the room. After a full minute, Vincent placed the file back on the table and leaned forward slightly. "What is this bank statement?" Arnold replied evenly. "Vendor transfers, shell company registrations, a full outline of your offshore structure. I thought it was time we were honest with each other." Vincent sat still. His face gave nothing away for several long seconds. Then he gave a short, breathless laugh and leaned back again. "You hired someone to investigate me?" "Yes," Arnold said, "and you left a long enough trail for him to follow it without much effort." Vincent's smirk faded slowly. "So what now? You calling the board the lawyer's press?" Arnold shook his head. "Not yet. First, I wanted to hear your explanation." Vincent leaned in again, his hands clasped now, eyes sharp. "You want to hear it? Fine. I did it because I was tired. Tired of working in your shadow. Tired of building this company and watching you get all the credit, the face, the reputation, the glory. And what did I get? The late nights, the dirty work, the deals no one wanted to touch." Arnold didn't flinch. "You got half of everything. You got a company worth 9 figures. You got my trust. And it was never enough." Vincent snapped his voice, rising for the first time. "Because every time I brought something to the table, you made me justify it. Explain it. Get your approval. You acted like you respected me, but we both know who everyone answered to. It was always your company. I just signed the checks." Arnold's voice dropped lower, but it was harder than before. "You didn't have to betray me to prove your worth. You just had to speak up. I would have listened, but instead you lied. You took, and you planned to take more." Vincent stood up, pushing his chair back with a controlled but audible scrape. "You think you can stop me with a few documents?" Arnold stood as well, calmly mirroring him. "No, I already have. The accounts are frozen. The access revoked. The legal team has been briefed. What you started stops today." Vincent's eyes darkened. "You don't know what I can do." "Maybe not," Arnold replied. "But I know what I won't let you do. This company will survive without you. I will too, because I know who I am, and I'm not the one who needs to hide behind shell corporations." For a moment, neither man moved. The conference room was silent, the air dense with everything that had been unsaid for years. Vincent finally grabbed his binder and turned for the door. At the threshold, he paused. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. Arnold didn't look away. "I regret trusting you. The rest I'll live with." Vincent left without another word. The door shut behind him with a soft but final click. Arnold stood still for a moment longer, letting the silence settle. Then he sat down slowly, the weight of the confrontation pressing into his shoulders. The betrayal had cut deep, but it was no longer a shadow. It had a face, a name, and now a clear end. Across the office, his assistant appeared quietly at the door. "Do you need anything?" Sir Arnold looked up, his voice steady. "Send a copy of this meeting's notes to legal and tell Julian he can release the full report to our attorneys." She nodded and disappeared. Alone again, Arnold closed the folder on the table and exhaled through his nose. There was more work to do, but the hardest part was done. Amber hadn't spoken to him since that morning. She hadn't needed to, and now more than ever, Arnold knew her voice had started a ripple that turned into a reckoning, a whisper of truth that had brought down a wall of lies. Arnold didn't call Amber right away. He waited, not because he had forgotten her role in what had just unfolded, but because he needed the dust to settle, the doors to close, and the silence to return before reaching back to the person who had seen the truth first. It had been 3 days since Vincent walked out of the office. 3 days of quiet legal meetings, account revisions, internal policy tightening, and long, thoughtful evenings alone in his office, staring out over the city. On the 4th morning, just after 7, he pulled up to Belmont Cafe and sat in his car for a few minutes before going in. It was still early, and the street was mostly empty. The air carried that cold clarity only early spring could deliver, fresh, honest, and just a little bitter. Inside, Amber was already working. She moved with the same precision, the same grace, the same understated presence he remembered. Nothing in her posture suggested she was waiting for recognition or gratitude. She was simply doing her job with dignity and care. Arnold waited until she was done at the last table before walking up to her quietly, not wanting to draw attention. "Amber," he said. She looked up quickly, eyes widening slightly, before settling into a calm, neutral expression. "Mr. Lawrence, good morning." He nodded once. "Do you have a few minutes? There's something I'd like to say." "In private." Amber hesitated, then glanced toward her manager, who gave a small nod from the counter. She set down her cloth and followed Arnold to a small seating area near the back, out of view from most of the patrons. He didn't sit right away. He stood across from her for a moment, then spoke. "I wanted to thank you," he said plainly, "not just for what you told me, but for how you said it. You risked your job, your comfort, maybe even your safety, just to make sure I didn't sign something I'd regret. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't expect to be believed, but you told the truth anyway." Amber looked down briefly, her voice quiet. "It just didn't feel right to walk away. That's all." "That's not all," Arnold replied, his voice soft but firm. "That's character, and it matters more than you think." She didn't speak. Her hands were clasped together, resting on the table, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Arnold pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. "I read your work from college," he said. "The article on transparency in corporate finance. You have a good mind, Amber. A clear one. I spoke with someone from your old department. They remembered you, said you had more potential than most people they've seen." Amber blinked. "You did all that?" He gave a small nod. "I did, and I want to offer you something. 2 things, actually." He sat down, then across from her, and looked her in the eye. "First, if you're still interested, I'd like to support you finishing your degree fully. No strings attached. Second, I want to bring you on board at the firm entry-level strategic finance department. You won't be anyone's assistant. You'll have mentorship room to grow, and more importantly, a seat at the table where your voice is heard. Amber stared at him, her throat tight. She didn't know what to say, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. Finally, she whispered, "Why me?" Arnold answered without hesitation, "Because you saw something everyone else missed, and because when it would have been easier to stay quiet, you spoke. I don't hire resumes. I work with people I trust." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. I haven't studied in years. I'm rusty. I'm not sure I could just pick up and compete with everyone else." "You don't have to be perfect," Arnold said gently. "You just have to start. The rest comes with time and effort. And based on what I've already seen, I know you can handle that part." She let out a breath. Not quite a laugh, but something close to release. "This feels like a lot all at once." He smiled, not patronizingly, but with understanding. "That's how it felt to me when you walked up to my table and told me the truth. And you handled that better than most executives I know would have." Amber finally nodded. It was small at first, hesitant, but then firm. "Okay," she said. "Yes, I want to try. I want to finish what I started." Arnold extended his hand across the table. "Then let's get started." She shook at her hand, trembling just slightly. As he stood to leave, Amber stayed behind for a moment, hands still clasped, heart racing with the weight of everything that had just changed. It wasn't just a job offer, it was dignity restored, a second chance, not handed out of pity, but earned with truth. She looked down at the table, then toward the window, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to picture a different future. One she was building for herself step by step, and finally, not alone. Amber's first day at Lawrence Kennedy was quiet, but beneath the surface, it was anything but simple. The building itself stood tall and understated in the heart of the financial district, a place she had passed by countless times while delivering coffee, never imagining she might one day belong inside. As she stepped through the revolving doors with a modest handbag and a notebook she had carried since college, her heart pounded with an uneasy rhythm that matched each footfall on the marble floors. She had dressed with care, a charcoal blouse, black slacks, minimal jewelry, professional polished, but not flashy. She didn't want to look like she was trying too hard, even though she was. The HR manager greeted her in the lobby and guided her through a brief orientation before introducing her to Sandra Klein, the senior associate in charge of the strategy team. Sandra was in her early 40s, sharp, well-spoken, and carried herself like someone used to being in control of outcomes. She welcomed Amber politely, though, with a certain formality, as if assessing not just her resume, but her purpose. "You'll be shadowing me for the first few weeks," Sandra said as they walked down the hallway toward the shared workspace. "Most of the work is research-driven. You'll be analyzing reports, compiling trend data, and sitting in on strategy reviews." Amber nodded, absorbing every word, eyes scanning the office layout, rows of glass offices, clean desks, quiet conversations. She was determined to prove herself. Not just to Arnold or Sandra, but to everyone who might wonder what a former waitress was doing in their world. And it didn't take long for the whispers to begin. She heard them before she saw the faces, the lowered voices near the water cooler, the glance exchanged across the elevator bay. They weren't overt, but she had lived long enough to recognize judgment disguised as curiosity. "I heard she used to work at Belmont," one woman whispered. "Really must be nice to know the CEO personally." Another replied. Amber didn't let it show, but inside it hit a nerve. She hadn't asked for special treatment. She hadn't leaned on sympathy, but perception was a powerful thing, and she could feel it shaping how people saw her before she had a chance to show what she could do. Still, she kept her head down and her focus sharp. She stayed late that first week, not because she had to, but because she refused to fall behind. On the fourth day, Sandra handed Amber a stack of financial statements and asked her to prepare a summary with risk assessments for an upcoming review. It was the first real assignment that gave her space to think on her own. Amber worked through the evening running numbers twice, cross-referencing historical data, flagging irregularities that hadn't been noticed in earlier reviews. The next morning, when Sandra read through her notes, her expression shifted slightly. "You caught this?" she asked, tapping a page with a red-marked vendor inconsistency. Amber nodded. The supplier's cost pattern didn't match industry movement. Looked like margin manipulation. Sandra didn't smile, but her tone softened. "Good work. We'll bring this up with procurement." That small acknowledgement meant more than any compliment. It wasn't about praise. It was proof that her work spoke louder than gossip. She kept building from there, one detail at a time, earning quiet nods from skeptical analysts and reluctant eye contact from those who had dismissed her on sight. Slowly, the conversations around her began to shift. Not completely, not instantly, but enough that she no longer felt invisible or misplaced. One afternoon, as she left the conference room after a long meeting, Arnold stepped into the hallway and matched her pace. He didn't say much at first, just walked beside her until they reached the corner near the break area. "I heard about the margin catch," he said finally. "Well done." Amber gave a small surprised smile. "Thank you." Arnold looked ahead for a moment, then added, "Sandra says, you ask smart questions that you don't guess that you dig." Amber met his gaze. "I try to be careful." "Good," he said. "There's no shortage of people who speak first and think later. You're not one of them. Keep going." He walked off before she could respond, but her chest tightened with a mix of relief and resolve. It hadn't been easy. It wouldn't be. But she was no longer wondering if she belonged. She was too busy proving that she did. By the end of her third week, Sandra invited her to sit in on a senior-level strategy meeting. Not to speak, just to observe. It was more than a courtesy. It was an unspoken endorsement. Inside that room, surrounded by directors and senior analysts, Amber took notes with precision, noted not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. During a pause, one of the directors turned to her and asked for clarification on a revenue trend she had flagged in a prior report. She answered clearly, directly, her tone, respectful but confident. When the meeting ended, Sandra gave her a nod. That evening, Amber sat at her desk, long after most had gone home, compiling her notes. She didn't feel exhausted. She felt anchored, like she had claimed something back. That night, as she left the building, she paused in the lobby, her reflection faint in the darkened glass. She no longer saw a waitress in borrowed confidence. She saw a strategist in the making. And no one, no assumption, no whisper was going to take that away from her again. Amber didn't expect what came next. It was a Thursday morning just after the weekly operations call when Sandra asked her to stop by Arnold's office. There was no urgency in her voice, but her tone carried weight, the kind that implied something important was coming. Amber walked through the quiet hallway, her pulse steady but alert. She knocked once, and Arnold looked up from his desk, motioning for her to come in. He closed the folder in front of him and leaned back slightly, the way someone does when they're about to change the direction of a conversation. "Take a seat," he said, not unkindly. Amber sat crossing her ankles, hands resting lightly in her lap. She didn't speak first. Arnold studied her for a long moment, as if measuring not just her readiness, but her endurance. "We've been working on something behind the scenes for a while," he began. "A new expansion project into Latin American markets. It's ambitious, complex, a lot of moving parts." Amber nodded, listening carefully. Arnold continued. "There's a leadership slot opening to head the early research and framework. Not management by title, but real responsibility, strategic planning, risk modeling, team coordination. It's the kind of role that sets the tone for everything that comes after." Amber's brows lifted slightly. "That sounds like a lot of ground to cover." Arnold gave a small smile. "It is. That's why I want you to lead it. The room felt still for a second too long. Amber looked at him, unsure she had heard correctly. Her heartbeat quickened. "Me? You," he confirmed. "Sandra agrees. You've shown clarity under pressure. Your work is solid, your instincts even better. And you have something I can't teach: integrity. That matters especially when you're building something new from the ground up." Amber sat back slightly, not from arrogance, but from the weight of what this meant. A few months ago, she had been wiping down booths and saving tips for textbooks she wasn't sure she'd ever use. Now, she was being asked to shape the early vision of an international venture. "I won't lie," she said carefully. "That scares me a little." Arnold didn't hesitate. "That's good. If it didn't, I'd worry you weren't paying attention. But fear and readiness are not the same thing. You're ready, Amber. Say yes, and we start next week." She looked down at her hands, then up again, and slowly nodded. "Yes, I'll do it." He nodded once, firm and satisfied. "Then, it's yours." Word of the assignment spread quickly within the department. Some were supportive, others more skeptical. A few kept their reactions neutral, but Amber felt the shift. There were glances in meetings, pauses when she offered ideas, moments when her presence seemed to stir a quiet question. No one voiced aloud. It wasn't that they resented her. It was that they didn't expect her, and that alone was enough to make every move she made feel like it had to be twice as sharp, twice as clean. She didn't waste energy on winning everyone over. She focused on the work. She assembled datasets, reached out to junior researchers, scheduled calls with local economic advisors. She drafted frameworks and rewrote them. She asked for feedback and accepted critique without flinching. Each night she left late, but not because she was behind, because she was building something that mattered. One afternoon, Sandra stopped by her desk with 2 printed documents. "You might want to include these in the next briefing." Clean breakdown on regional tax implications. Amber accepted them with a small nod. "Thank you. I'll fold them into the overview tonight." Sandra lingered a moment longer. "You're making it hard for the doubters." Amber didn't look up immediately. When she did, she answered simply, "That's not my goal." Sandra smiled, but it was faint, like she knew something Amber hadn't said aloud. "Maybe not, but it's still a good side effect." The next morning, during the department-wide planning review, Arnold joined unannounced. He stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching as Amber delivered her update to the team. She walked through risk matrices, regulatory conditions, and a forecast model she'd adjusted the night before after a last-minute regional shift. She didn't stumble. She didn't over-explain. When someone challenged her projection, she responded with data, not defensiveness. When the meeting ended, people lingered longer than usual. A few nodded at her as they left. One even clapped her shoulder lightly in acknowledgement. Arnold stepped forward as the last person exited. "That was the sharpest segment in the room today," he said. Amber let out a breath, controlled but honest. "It's getting clearer every day." He looked at her a moment longer, then added quietly, "When you're ready, we'll start talking about what comes after this project." She met his gaze without blinking. "I'll be ready." He nodded once, turned and left. Amber stayed behind, organizing her notes slowly. Outside, the city moved with its usual pace, unaware that somewhere in a quiet corner office, a woman who once served coffee to executives was now shaping the blueprint of their next frontier. She didn't need everyone to understand how far she'd come. She only needed to keep going. A month later, the company held its annual strategy summit, a formal yet celebratory gathering where milestones were acknowledged and future directions revealed. The ballroom they rented shimmered with soft lighting and quiet grandeur, the kind of space where people naturally stood taller and spoke more carefully. Employees from every department filled the room, dressed sharp, their conversations light, with just enough formality to remind everyone of where they were. The stage at the front of the room bore a sleek podium and a large screen looping company highlights. It had been a long year, one that tested every layer of the organization's integrity, and it was time to show what had endured. Amber stood near the side wall, quietly scanning the room. She had been asked to attend as part of the leadership team, but she hadn't expected what came next. When Arnold took the stage, the room naturally settled into silence. He spoke clearly, with the practiced cadence of someone who had learned long ago that truth didn't need to shout to be heard. He recapped the year's challenges, delicately brushing past the Vincent fallout, and then pivoted to what came next. "There are people in this room who stepped up when it wasn't easy," he said, eyes scanning the audience slowly, "who brought not just effort, but clarity, judgment, grit. One of them is someone most of you didn't know a few months ago, someone who came from outside our walls, but who now stands as a core part of our future." Amber felt a small knot form in her stomach. Arnold continued. "Amber Jenkins led the foundation work for our Latin America expansion. She did it with humility, discipline, and without expectation. And today, I'm proud to share that she'll be joining our executive leadership team as Director of Strategic Growth Initiatives." There was a brief, charged silence, then a wave of applause, some genuine, some surprised, a few hesitant, but it grew quickly, and Amber felt it wash over her in a wave of heat and disbelief. She walked toward the stage as Arnold stepped aside. Her steps were calm, her face composed, but inside her chest, a quiet tremble remained. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone just slightly, and looked out across the sea of faces, some familiar, some still unsure of her, some smiling with pride. "I don't have much to say," she began, her voice steady, "but I want to thank those who gave me a chance to contribute, not because of where I came from, but because of what I brought to the table. I didn't expect this, but I'm ready to earn it." The room applauded again, and she nodded once before stepping back. Arnold met her at the edge of the stage with a brief handshake and a look that said more than words could. She returned to her seat, still absorbing what had just happened. As the program continued, she allowed herself a small moment of reflection. Not long ago, she had walked into a cafe, just another shift in a string of quiet, invisible days. And now here she was, visible, respected, empowered, not because someone had handed her a title, but because she had walked step by step through fire and never stopped moving forward. Later that evening, as the room emptied and conversations moved to soft goodbyes and polite laughter, Arnold found her near the balcony. He had taken off his jacket, his tie loosened slightly, the formality of the day slipping away. "How does it feel?" he asked. Amber took a moment before answering. "Like something I don't want to waste." He nodded. "That's the right way to see it. This role, it's not about impressing anyone. It's about making sure the people behind you have someone to look toward, just like I looked toward you when you told me the truth that day." Amber smiled, a slow, thoughtful expression. "Thank you for believing in me before anyone else did. You made it easy," he said simply. They stood in silence for a few seconds, looking out over the city skyline. The night was clear, the air cool, and the view seemed sharper than usual. As they returned to the main floor, Amber walked a few steps ahead, confident, composed, carrying with her not just a new title, but a new weight, the good kind, the kind built from earned, grounded principles and quiet victories. Her story wasn't finished, but for the first time, it was being written on her terms. And this chapter, long overdue, was just the beginning of what she was ready to claim. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.